Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Redford, and this is the follow-up. Coming up on tonight's show, it's been almost 5 years since Michigan voters approved the use of recreational marijuana. So what are the results so far? Proponents said it would be a cash cow for local cities and towns and for business owners dealing in cannabis. It was also seen as a way to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana use. On the other hand, critics say it's sending a bad message, particularly for our youth, who are using and abusing substances of all kinds at higher numbers. You will hear both sides of that issue next, but first we have viewer feedback from last week's program here on the follow-up. We focused on the UAW strike against the Big Three, which continues, as you know. One of our viewers who watched us on YouTube said this, quote, "I'll feel more sympathetic if Mary's Barra pay gets cut in half and the $12.5 million goes into the 40% they're asking for," because she's referring to GM CEO Mary Barra and the estimated $25 million Barra received last year in salary, benefits, and stock options, supposedly. Most can barely afford a new car now without a 7-year payment, let alone if this goes through for the Big Three. Get your money, but be mindful of stepping on your own toes. So thank you for that comment. Much appreciated. We'd like to hear from more of you to help drive the conversation here on the show. You can do that in a variety of ways via social media on Facebook, or you can dial into our follow-up hotline to voice your opinion or suggest future show topics. And if you'd like to watch any of our past shows, you can tune into YouTube, as that viewer did, or log into our website at deltacollegepublicmedia.org. So there we go. Now for tonight's show, we've got two wonderful guests joining us live remote from the Metro Detroit area. Karen O'Keefe, she is with the Marijuana Policy Project, or MPP. Thank you for dialing in remote tonight, Karen.
Thank you for having me on the show.
You bet. And across from me here in the studio, a regular here on the follow-up, Lori Ziolkowski. She's got a new position with the Families Against Narcotics. You're on the new Director of Chapter Development statewide, so hope to hear about that during the show. So,
great to see you.
Karen, let me start with you. It's been almost 5 years. November 2018, when Michigan voters approved the use of marijuana for recreational sales and use. So, what are some of the results? Is it delivering what you hoped it would, generating revenue, decriminalizing small marijuana use? So, where are we with this?
Yeah, so it's increased freedom for adults. It's helped the economy, and it's increased justice. In the last year prior to legalization, there were over 16,000 Michiganders that were arrested for simple possession of cannabis. In 2019, there were less than 800. So in total, we've probably prevented 78,000 people from being arrested and marked with a criminal record that can shut the door on their entire life of opportunity. It can make it very difficult to get a job, housing, continue their education. So we've stopped the criminalization, and at the same time, cannabis, instead of being sold on the streets where it's completely unregulated and where violence often results, it's sold in regulated businesses operated by Michigan residents. Cannabis is taxed, it's regulated, it's lab tested for potency and for contaminants. So instead of enriching the next Al Capone, that money is going into roads, it's going into your local communities, it's going into tax coffers. In all, by the 5-year anniversary, it looks like the state will have hit $1 billion in tax revenue just from cannabis sales, in addition to stopping the criminalization of, the 10 to 15% or so of Michigan residents that use cannabis.
Yeah, and Michigan's not alone. We do have a graphic, a United States map that shows Michigan is one of, I think, 23 states right now that has approved recreational use of marijuana. Many of those 23 states also have had previously approved medical marijuana. In Michigan, I think it might have been 10 years earlier. Looking ahead, there's a trend. I know a lot of other states are looking at that. That's kind of the in your wheelhouse, kind of the work that you do at MPP. Ohio looks like, at least the polls are saying, I guess in November, they may approve it. So this is a trend here. So what does that tell you? That we're going to be over 50% in a couple of years, and then in time, maybe the federal government will say, you know, this is something that should be approved nationwide, because right now it's sort of illegal on a federal level, right?
Yeah, we have 68% of the American public thinks cannabis should be legal. But still, even though almost half the U.S. population lives in legal states, and far more than that live in medical cannabis states, it's still federally illegal, albeit the federal laws are generally not being enforced. But it still creates tons of problems for people that are in HUD housing, people that are immigrants. It increases the cost of everything for cannabis businesses, which makes it harder for them to outcompete with the illicit market. So our hope is that the Senate and Congress will follow the lead of the states that have moved first. When it came to alcohol prohibition, the states were the first to criminalize alcohol, and they were also the first to stop enforcement of alcohol prohibition. So we're seeing a kind of similar trend 100 years later, with the states having been the first to criminalize marijuana and also being the first to stop criminalization. But it's taken a lot longer.
Yeah, good historical perspective there. So Lori, I'm going to come to you because you've been a long time opponent of substance abuse of all kinds. You've sat in that seat before, and we've talked about that, both as a mom who had a daughter who had some serious substance abuse issues. Thankfully, she's doing great now.
She is.
And now you've been an advocate for families against narcotics. So kind of give us your set of things as you see it, because you don't disagree on some areas, but I know you've got a little message for us tonight.
Sure. So our stance is we are not prohibitionists, and clearly this is something that the American people want to have access to. So we're not here to say we should not have legalization. In fact, I think it's silly to have it just state by state. If it's going to be legal, let's make it legal. If it's going to be illegal, let's make it illegal. It doesn't make any sense to have it both ways. So we're not opposing that. But what I am asking for is any industry who sells mood and mind altering drugs that they do a better job of explaining the risks to adults and also explaining the risks to young people. So if a young person's brain is exposed to a chemical before their frontal lobe is developed, they have a much higher rate of becoming addicted to that or having that propel them down the path to addiction, like what happened to our daughter. Some of the THC levels in the products that are available now, it's not like the 70s and 80s, back when I was a teenager or a student here at Delta College, when the marijuana that was available had single-digit THCs. So some of the adverse effects that we're seeing locally is we're having kids come into emergency departments with THC psychosis. So as a parent, I say, well, where was the parent? And you might say that to me. How did my daughter become a heroin addict when I was a room mom, a popcorn mom, a PTA mom? You cannot be with your children 24/7. And one of the biggest risk factors of becoming addicted to something is age of first use and availability of drug. So I think we need to do better as an industry to make sure that we are educating people on the risks that are involved, especially when underage use is happening, and we need to do a better job of keeping it out of the hands of people. There was just a study that I heard on the news tonight, as a matter of fact, that said, especially with online shopping, that many of those distributors do not check for age. So kids can still get their hands on it, and that's what I have a big issue with. We got to do better with protecting our kids. Yeah,
the report you referenced this afternoon, I read it as well. It came out of Forbes. That's where it was published. I'm not sure who wrote it necessarily. So Karen, how do you address some of that in terms of, I think what Lori's saying needs more education. I'm not sure it's getting out of the hands of young people who aren't of age yet to have this stuff, and also some of the online, if they're not verifying ages. That's some work that you guys are able to do, and what do you think of that, I guess?
Yeah, so we're a pretty scrappy small nonprofit, and we work mostly on changing laws in key states. One thing that's been very encouraging is that as we've seen states legalize cannabis, first, we have not seen those states' teen cannabis use increase. In Michigan, pre-legalization in 2017, the CDC's Healthy Kids survey found 23.7% of teenagers self-reported using marijuana. In the most recent study in 2021, that was down to 14%. So that is a very significant drop that Michigan youth have seen, which is incredibly encouraging. Nationwide, since legalization began, when I was growing up, every year the Monitoring the Future survey would find that between 80 and 90% of teenagers said that cannabis was very easy or fairly easy to get. That dropped below 80% for the first time post-legalization and is now below 70%. So we can always do better and should do better with education and age gating, but to me it's really sends the signal that by putting cannabis sales out of the schools and out of the streets and into stores, we are seeing a reduction in availability, and we're seeing a reduction, at least in Michigan, and a steady number that hasn't gone up in all of the legalization states as a whole. So I'm very encouraged by those numbers. Certainly, we can always do more with education. We should continue to have education, but we have not seen negative adverse effects from legalization when it comes to kids' use rates.
What do you attribute that to?
Well, I grew up in Michigan, and when I was in high school, I know anybody who wanted to get marijuana could very easily just drive to a specific open-air drug market and purchase it. I know people that had guns pulled on them. I knew people that had cannabis that was laced with other drugs they never would have voluntarily used. At the point all the sales to adults are beyond the counter, you're not going to see people on the street selling cannabis as much, so it won't be so easy. You know, some children are still going to get access to cannabis just as they do to liquor, but they won't be driving to an open-air drug market where it's being sold alongside and sometimes laced with other drugs.
You know, I think what we see a lot in the news, it comes to like a youngster getting a hold of an edible, or doing some vaping, or the concentrate. So sometimes that's a parental or an adult situation. They've got to do a better job of, keeping that out of hands of kids.
Yeah, we're terrible at that in our culture.
We are terrible, so we have to get better at that. But also, I think there's sort of a message to our youth that this is cool, this is hip, and so I'm going to go down that path. So
I think it puts our children at risk when more adults are using it in the home, and we have the ability to have edibles, to have large amounts of dried, to have 12 plants in our home. When most children get their first alcohol from either their own refrigerator or liquor cabinet or their friend's refrigerator or liquor cabinet, or you have an older brother or sister who buys for you, or an uncle. So while there might be fewer drive-up, like we had here down at our parks, drive-up places to get marijuana, it doesn't mean that the marijuana supply has decreased. It's actually increased. And so there are still plenty of ways for children to access that. And so again, we need to do a better job of making sure that the adults understand the risk of allowing children to have it. Same thing with vaping. Adults who vape think that it's no big deal when their kids get caught vaping. I was just at a youth conference in Midland last week where I was on a panel with 3 of the local city police departments who are the in-school resource officers. And the kids who get busted with vaping, even if it's just nicotine, a lot of their parents think it's no big deal. I was at the very next night, I was at John Glenn High School where I graduated from on a parent night, and the next day when we were talking about use, there were 7 referrals for marijuana use from kids using it in school, vaping it. So it has not gone away. Right. There might be studies to show that, and the self-reporting, there's some validity issues with that, but it just doesn't make sense to me that we've increased the supply and now the use has gone down. I don't get the math on that.
Right. Karen, obviously we're testing the marijuana a lot better. There's more regulation. So in the long term, as we're dealing with it now, while some of the marijuana may be more potent, what we're getting, it is being regulated and it's safer, right? Overall, is what you're saying?
Yeah, they've had studies on cannabis that you buy on the illicit market and found that a lot of it had pesticides that might be legal to use on a tree or a bush, but if you put it on cannabis and heat it up, it's not safe to inhale. Some of the pesticides converted to hydrogen cyanide when they were heated up and inhaled. Cannabis absorbs heavy metals, so there's dangerous heavy metals available in cannabis when it's on the illicit market and not tested. And of course, people have no idea of the potency or if there might be another drug that cannabis is laced with when they're getting it on the illicit market. And while there are higher potency products that are available, hash has been available forever as well, there are a lot of cannabis consumers that also are wanting other cannabinoids that aren't intoxicating to be in their cannabis. Things like CBD that ameliorate the psychoactive effects of THC, CBN that can help with sleep. And so the consumer is able to choose exactly, know exactly what they're getting. And even those using higher potency products, many of which do it for medical reasons, are able to titrate their dose and just inhale fewer times and then have less possible negative effects to breathing if they just take a few puffs instead of having to take many.
Yeah, can you expand on the marijuana, medical marijuana side of things? Because a lot of people have been using that for great benefits long before recreational use was approved, and they're still using it in larger numbers.
Yeah, so in 2008, voters in Michigan approved a medical cannabis law, and it's still in effect, but now a lot of people who are using cannabis are doing it as an over-the-counter medication too. Some of them don't have a doctor who's knowledgeable about cannabis. Some have a medical condition that's not listed in the medical cannabis program, such as insomnia. And some simply don't want to be in a government list or don't want to have to pay the fine. A study of people that were buying on the adult use, not medical line in Colorado, found that over 60% were using cannabis for pain relief and over 70% were using it for sleep. And a lot of studies have found that people that are using cannabis are able to report reducing their use of other very dangerous drugs such as opioids. So for many people, it's actually proven to be an exit drug instead of the gateway that people are concerned about.
A couple other things, items that I think critics talked about before this passed in 2018 was that marijuana is largely a cash business. It has been for a lot of years. They're making some changes with debit cards and so forth, but part of the time it passed, it's largely a cash business, so they were concerned about sort of maybe petty crime around some of these dispensaries. Another one is that it might increase sort of traffic accidents if more and more people are on the road under the influence of marijuana. Everything that I've read, I don't think it's tipped the dial or moved the dial much, at least not as much as they thought it was going to. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, so I looked at the federal data on the number of traffic crashes and injuries. Actually, it was Michigan-specific data, and there hasn't been an increase in collisions in Michigan. It's actually gone down, or injury-related collisions, or even total number of impaired driving collisions in Michigan post-legalization. The number of alcohol-involved collisions has gone down a bit, which is encouraging. So we haven't seen any negatives there in terms of crimes on cannabis businesses. Of course, when cannabis is sold illegally, there's a huge vulnerability. People that are selling cannabis in the illicit market are not going to call the police if they get robbed. And so both the seller and the buyer are at great risk of assault and robbery. And there have been deaths, including in Michigan, related to illegal sales. So I haven't heard of any increase in violence post-legalization. You do have some benefit if you have what were previously empty storefronts. Some studies have shown that the foot traffic, security, the cameras that are required can actually reduce petty crime by just having the eyes on the ground that are so important to public safety.
Lori, with your group with FAN, I know you have some law enforcement folks that are part of the work that you do. How much of this are you discussing? Do any of what she told us about some of the, haven't seen an increase in any of that petty crime, traffic accidents. Are you seeing it differently at all?
So some of the things that are interesting, we also remember we're not just post-legalization or decriminalization of cannabis, we are also post-COVID. So most of us weren't driving for 2.5 years, and I have to think that impacted some of those crashes because there weren't that many cars on the road. So that has to a factor into that. It'd be interesting to see what happens 5 years down the road. And again, we do partner a lot with, we have 133 police departments that we work with throughout the state, and I interact with them very, very regularly, especially the school resource officers who are just painting a very different picture than what some of the maybe the bigger statistics look like. We're talking boots on the ground. These are folks in the schools and having interactions with kids who it's having a very negative impact on their lives. And the biggest thing that it comes back to is that the parents of those children do not see marijuana as having any risk. And just like with cigarettes, they used to have doctors actually promoting Camels are the best cigarettes to smoke. We need to get to a point where we're saying there are risks, because there's nothing that's no risk, right? Even water, if you drink too much water, you can die from that. There's a risk involved in everything. We just have to do a better job of letting parents know the risk for their children. And I'm not saying, oh my gosh, this is panic. We didn't think the world was going to come to an end when cannabis became legal, and it hasn't. But are we seeing negative effects on our children? Yes, we are. We absolutely are, and I hear it every single week from those officers, from the emergency departments that we work with. We have to protect our kids better. And like I was saying before, we should partner, the cannabis industry should partner with the prevention industry. Prevention people oftentimes have lock boxes that they literally get grants for, and they have hundreds of them. Those should be for free in every single cannabis dispensary. So when you buy your cannabis, you take that home. When you buy your opiates, you take home Narcan. We are all about reduction of deaths, reduction of harm, and if somebody's using cannabis as a reduction of harm of getting off opioids, we're not opposed to that either. Where I'm opposed to it is if it's affecting children and if it's causing a negative impact on people's lives, whether it's their physical, mental, emotional, financial state. I have heard, again, anecdotally from police officers, are they pulling people over who are high? Yeah, they are. because why wouldn't they? And I think you're going to start seeing less and less alcohol use like we are with young people. They're using less alcohol and cigarettes, tobacco, and they're using more vapes and THC. So we're just shifting substance use to different substances. We have to be more mindful. The cigarette industry should have taught us a lesson that we do have to start from ground level and let people know of the risks and be very upfront about that. Is it going to be most people? No. But the statistic that was quoted, 75% of people don't get in trouble with it. Well, what about if you're in the family of that 25%? That's a significant number. We can do better.
So when your group gets together, Fan, and you're the new chapter development director, so I'm assuming your chapters are growing, at least that's what you're working on. Are the meetings largely about, are they talking about recreational use of marijuana? Are they talking about other things? How much of your conversations are focused on sort of marijuana versus opioids or other things that are out there?
So the Families Against Narcotics is a bit of a misnomer. We just want to make sure that people don't fall into addiction regardless of the substance, and if they do, that there's a way out for them. So our conversations involve how are substances having a negative impact on anybody's life, especially those of children. And so we talk about all substances. We help people with any substance because we want to make sure that people are living productive, healthy, happy lives. For some people, they can use cannabis. It does not have a negative impact on it. I realize that.
Right.
But there is going to be a portion, and I think as a culture, we have decided we'd rather have legalization of alcohol, even though we're going to have a portion of people with that's a huge impact. We're going to legalize gambling, even though we know there's a proportion of people that's going to have a huge negative impact. We just have to be aware, even if it might be the minority, that once that happens in your family, it's a very negative impact on the individual, the family, and the community. So we just got to reduce those numbers as much as we can.
So Karen, we talked about this a bit before the show that sort of came up, and you did touch on the fact that, you know, a lot of the proceeds from the profits from marijuana sales go to various percentages, roads, bridges, other places, but nothing specifically like 10% for substance abuse, rehabilitation. Should we have some money going to that, do you think? Does that need to be something we need to improve upon? Or?
Yeah, we've certainly supported laws in a number of states that had earmark in the cannabis tax revenue to go to substance abuse prevention and treatment and education for responsible cannabis use, things like locking your cannabis up, not having teenagers use cannabis and not driving under the influence of cannabis. So that can be a good idea. I know a significant portion of the revenue goes to the general fund and to cities, which of course can choose to use that revenue for the same type of programming. So it's important programming, whether it comes out of the general fund or the cannabis tax revenue, to make sure that there is substance abuse treatment and public education and consumer education.
Okay. And another question I wanted to ask you that I didn't at the beginning, as we're 5 years into this with the recreational use when we approved that in 2018 of November, what were some of the learnings, roadblocks, challenges that you've learned that you had to get through that you learned?
Sure. A couple things that have been challenging in Michigan include that localities are allowed to opt out. The local city councils can decide not to have cannabis stores. We can't prohibit people from using it at home. But that's created a situation where only about 10% of the cities, although they have more population, allow cannabis businesses, even in cities where voters approved the initiative. So you end up with having people have to drive longer distances or get deliveries, and having those localities not get the tax revenue that's allocated to those that opt in. The other challenge is federal law, which, as we mentioned, continues to prohibit cannabis and continues to make everything more expensive. And that makes it harder for legal cannabis businesses to operate and to outcompete the illicit market when they have, pay up to a 70% effective federal tax because they cannot deduct their business expenses, and you end up with issues with immigration and many other facets of life, people that are gun owners that could theoretically get 15 years in prison because they're also cannabis consumers.
And tell me again, expand on MPP, the Marijuana Policy Project. You're not just a Michigan organization, you're national in scope. So talk to us about what it is you guys do. Yeah,
we were founded in 1995. We are a nonprofit funded by people that think that cannabis should be legal for medical use, for adult use, people who think that cannabis consumers should not be punished for using cannabis, and that think that regulation is a better approach than prohibition. We work state by state, and we're the lead organization in 15 of the medical cannabis laws that passed, and more than half of the legalization laws that passed. And we just keep working to change laws. We support public health provisions, the kind that Lori was talking about. We certainly support educating people about the possible harms of cannabis. We're not pro-cannabis or anti-cannabis. We're anti-locking people up and pro-regulation.
And Lori, just to expand with a couple of minutes that we do, what are some new initiatives you're working on at FAN? I know you got some events coming up in the fall. You've done the Hopes Not Handcuffs. Mm-hmm. You've done some of the Heroes events, so what do you want to promote tonight?
We continue to support folks who have been impacted negatively by addiction and whatever substance that caused in their life. We continue to partner with police departments, with emergency departments, with prevention specialists to make sure that people have a way out. So we need more money for treatment facilities. This is causing an issue. When we look at our 10,000 people that we help, we take a lot of data from that on what substances they're struggling with, and this is going to surprise you. On 3 of the last quarters, alcohol was number 1, and marijuana showed up as the 3rd for the first time in a quarter, that marijuana is something that people are struggling with. So again, we can't discount that there are negative impacts of this. We have to be cognizant of that. And if we're going to put money into it, it has to go to the right place, and that's for prevention and for treatment. Roads and bridges are not going to help people stay out of addiction or get them out when they're needed. Our availability of treatment is terrible in this state and even worse across the country. We've had people move to Michigan because at least they can get Medicaid and then get treatment. There are many states who don't even have that option. So when we call to get somebody into treatment placement, it can be up to 2 weeks before we can get somebody a bed into treatment. And that's a really, really tough thing. And this is a life-altering situation, not only for the individual, but for their families. So I know in Bay City, where I live, it's $5,000 to open up a marijuana dispensary. I think that's way too low of a number. Anybody can get in. That's a cheap used car. If we're going to have facilities like that, I think the price needs to be a lot higher. I think a lot more of that money needs to be earmarked to get people the help that they need and to do better with education.
Ken, what do you think of that? I don't know if that's part of the work that you do to charge how much it is to get a dispensary.
Yeah, so I don't favor high licensing fees because then only those that have a great deal of access to capital are going to be able to get licenses. We do think it's important that small businesses and people that have been the most impacted by the war on drugs be able to participate in this new industry. Certainly having some tax revenue, whether again it's from the general funds or earmark, go to prevention is very important. But it is hard for cannabis businesses to compete because of federal law and to be profitable.
It's been a great discussion. Karen O'Keefe, thank you for joining us with MPP.org, Marijuana Policy Project. Lori Ziolkowski, always great to have you in. Good discussion. We can do it again down the road. Appreciate it. And that's our show for tonight, but be sure to join us again next week. We'll discuss all the twists and turns surrounding the sexual harassment allegations leveled at former MSU coach Mel Tucker. We'll see you next week.